For 45 years, I quietly supported my son through every challenge, from bandaging his childhood scrapes to putting him through medical school, until my daughter-in-law decided I was becoming too frail and needed to be moved to an assisted living facility against my wishes. But when their prestigious medical practice suddenly faced a malpractice crisis that threatened everything they'd built, and every high-priced attorney in town mysteriously declined to take their case, her face turned ashen as she learned the truth. She had no idea that while I was tending my garden and volunteering at the community clinic, I had also spent the last decade serving as the respected chairperson of the State Medical Ethics Board with connections to every major hospital and law firm in the region. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never imagined that at 73, I would find myself being discussed like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. When you devote your life to caring for others, nurturing them, healing them, supporting them through their most vulnerable moments, you naturally expect that same care and respect in return. That's the unspoken promise of family, isn't it? That the compassion you've shown will eventually come full circle. My name is Virginia Winters. For 38 years, I worked as a registered nurse at Memorial Hospital in Lakeside, Michigan, specializing in pediatric care. I wasn't just a nurse who came and went with shift changes. I was the nurse that families remembered decades later, the one they sought out during return visits, the one who received handmade cards and heartfelt letters years after their children had recovered. I loved my career with every fiber of my being. Each morning as I pinned my badge to my uniform, I felt a profound sense of purpose. Nursing wasn't just a job. It was a calling that aligned perfectly with my deepest values of compassion, service, and human dignity. My husband, Robert, had been my college sweetheart. We married young, just after I completed my nursing degree, with nothing but optimism and student loans to our names. Robert became an engineer for the automotive industry, designing safety systems that quietly saved countless lives. He worked behind the scenes, without recognition or fanfare, simply doing what he believed was right. His gentle strength and ethical clarity formed the foundation of our family life. We had one child, our son Michael, born after 7 years of marriage. From the beginning, he showed an extraordinary sensitivity to others' pain and a natural inclination toward healing. By age 10, he could properly bandage a wound and knew the correct dosage of children's medication by weight. While other boys, his age collected sports cards or comic books, Michael kept a carefully organized notebook of medical facts and terminology. "Mom, do you think I could be a doctor someday?" he asked me once, looking up from a medical encyclopedia he'd checked out from the library. "With your compassion and intelligence, you could be an extraordinary physician," I told him. "But remember that the most important medical instrument isn't the stethoscope. It's the ability to truly see the person in front of you." When Michael was 17, everything changed. Robert was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, already advanced by the time symptoms appeared. Despite having connections throughout the medical community, nothing could stop the rapid progression of his disease. 6 months later, my husband was gone, leaving a void that could never be filled and a son on the cusp of adulthood who had just lost his father. The timing couldn't have been more challenging. Michael was in his senior year of high school, applying to colleges with pre-med programs. The financial reality we faced was daunting. Robert's life insurance would help, but wouldn't cover the extensive costs of medical school. I took on additional nursing shifts, moved us to a smaller house, and eliminated every unnecessary expense to ensure Michael's dream wouldn't be derailed by our loss. "I don't have to go to medical school right away, Mom," Michael offered during one of our late-night conversations. "I could work for a few years first, help ease the financial burden." "Absolutely not," I insisted. "Your father would want you to follow your path without delay. We'll make it work." And we did make it work, though the cost was significant. I rarely took vacations, worked holiday shifts for the extra pay, and deferred my own retirement savings. These weren't sacrifices I resented. They were investments in my son and in the patients he would someday heal. Every exam he passed, every clinical rotation he completed, felt like a victory we shared. Michael thrived in medical school, his natural empathy and analytical mind perfectly suited to the challenges of modern medicine. During his infrequent visits home, I noticed subtle changes, his vocabulary becoming more technical, his perspective more clinical, his circle of friends increasingly limited to fellow medical students. These were natural evolutions, and I was proud of his growing expertise even as I sometimes missed the wide-eyed boy who had once asked me to explain how Band-Aids worked. After graduation and residency, Michael accepted a position at Lakeside Medical Partners, a prestigious practice known for treating many of the region's most influential families. His success filled me with quiet pride. Isn't this what parents hope for? That their children will build upon the foundation they provided to create something meaningful with their lives? I retired from full-time nursing at 68, though I continued to volunteer at community health clinics. Retirement also gave me the opportunity to accept a position on the state medical ethics board, something I'd been invited to do years earlier but hadn't had time to properly fulfill. The role suited me perfectly. My decades of hands-on patient care complemented the more theoretical perspectives of the physicians and attorneys on the board. Within 3 years, I was nominated to serve as chairperson, a position that carried significant influence in medical licensing, hospital oversight, and healthcare policy throughout the state. It was at a hospital fundraiser that Michael first introduced me to Catherine Harrington. I knew immediately that this woman was significant to my son. I could see it in the protective way he stood beside her, in how his eyes followed her movements across the room, in the slight nervousness with which he presented her to me. "Mom, this is Kathy," he said. "She's a neurologist at University Hospital." Catherine was striking in a polished way, tall and athletic with perfectly styled blonde hair, wearing a simple but obviously expensive dress that communicated both professional success and impeccable taste. Her handshake was firm, her smile confident but measured. "Michael speaks of you constantly, Mrs. Winters," she said. "It's wonderful to finally meet you." "Please, call me Virginia," I replied warmly. "And I'm delighted to meet you too. Michael has mentioned a brilliant neurologist who's been occupying much of his thoughts lately." Throughout the evening, I learned that Catherine came from considerable family status. Her father was chief of surgery at University Hospital before retirement. Her mother had been on the board of trustees for the same institution. She had attended prestigious schools throughout her education, completing her medical training at Johns Hopkins before returning to Michigan for her practice. She was unfailingly polite throughout our interactions, asking appropriate questions about my nursing career and listening with apparent interest to my responses. Yet I couldn't help noticing how the conversation changed when it turned to topics closer to her world: breakthrough research, hospital politics, mutual connections with Michael's colleagues. Her entire demeanor became more animated, more authentic, as though she had shifted from obligatory small talk to matters of genuine substance. As their relationship progressed, I observed a gradual transformation in Michael. Some changes were subtle, new expressions in his vocabulary, shifted priorities in his schedule, opinions on healthcare policy he'd never previously expressed. Others were more pronounced: a growing preoccupation with professional networking, increased attention to status symbols, occasional name-dropping of influential figures he'd met through Catherine's connections. Our weekly Sunday dinners continued, sometimes at my home but increasingly at upscale restaurants where Catherine would join us. I was always welcomed politely, always included in the conversation, yet increasingly aware of being positioned as a quaint reminder of Michael's roots, rather than a valued contributor to his current life. "Virginia, Michael tells me you're still volunteering at that community clinic," Catherine remarked during one such dinner. "How fulfilling that must be. My mother serves on the hospital foundation board, And she always says grassroots healthcare is so important for underserved populations. The compliment, wrapped within subtle condescension, became a familiar pattern. My decades of nursing experience were reduced to working with patients, so hands-on and direct. My involvement with the State Medical Ethics Board was such important community service. My gardening was such a wholesome hobby for retirement. Each comment managed to simultaneously acknowledge and diminish my life's work, positioning it as worthy but fundamentally less significant than the sophisticated medical world that Catherine inhabited. The engagement, when it came, was both expected and surprising in its execution. Rather than the thoughtful, private moment I might have imagined, it was announced via a professionally photographed social media post from an exclusive restaurant, followed by a group celebration at Catherine's parents' lakefront home, where I was invited, but somehow always seemed to be seated at the periphery of important conversations. "It was perfect, Mom," Michael told me excitedly the following day. "I proposed at Le Ciel after consulting with her father. He and her mother were waiting at the restaurant to celebrate with us right after she said yes. Everyone important was there to share the moment." "It sounds wonderful," I said, pushing aside a small pang that I had been included only in the aftermath, rather than being among those deemed important enough for advance consultation. "I'm very happy for you both. Have you thought about when and where you'd like to have the wedding?" "That's another exciting part," he continued enthusiastically. "The Lakeview Medical Center is opening its new neuroscience wing this fall, and Catherine's father arranged for us to have the first private event in the rooftop reception space. It's practically impossible to book, but as a founding donor to the wing, Dr. Harrington has special privileges." "The hospital? For your wedding?" I repeated, processing the implications. "That seems rather clinical for such a personal celebration." "Not the hospital itself, Mom," Michael clarified with slight impatience. "The reception venue at the top of the new medical building. It's the most exclusive space in the city with views of the entire lake. Only hospital leadership and major donors will ever have access to it." As weeks passed, information about the wedding came in carefully measured doses, each revelation more elaborate than the last. The rooftop venue apparently cost more than my annual pension. Catherine had selected flowers flown in from overseas, hired a renowned chef from Chicago, and arranged for a string quartet from the symphony orchestra. I was told that my role would be carefully coordinated, closer to the date, but concrete details remained elusive despite my increasingly direct questions. 2 months before the wedding, I still had no clear information about what I was expected to wear, when I should arrive at the venue, or what role I would play in the ceremony itself. My growing concerns were met with vague reassurances that everything is being handled by the wedding planner, and that I should just plan to enjoy the day without worrying about details. Finally, I decided that clarity was needed, whatever the answer might be. I invited Michael to dinner at my home, a tradition we had maintained, though less frequently, throughout his adult life. I prepared his favorite meal, pot roast with garden vegetables and homemade apple pie for dessert, and waited with a mixture of determination and dread for the conversation we clearly needed to have. He arrived looking slightly distracted, checking his phone repeatedly throughout dinner while maintaining a stream of casual conversation. Updates on interesting cases, anecdotes about hospital politics, mentions of weekend plans with Catherine and their shared colleagues. I let this continue through the main course, appreciating these glimpses into his life, even as I prepared myself for the more difficult discussion to come. As I served apple pie and coffee, I finally broached the subject directly. "Michael, I need to know what the plans are for my role in your wedding. It's only 2 months away, and I haven't received any information about what I should wear, when I should arrive, or what responsibilities I might have as mother of the groom." He set down his fork, a flash of discomfort crossing his features before he composed himself. "About that, Mom. Catherine and I have been meaning to talk to you. The thing is, the wedding has become much more significant than we initially planned. Some very important people from both the medical and research communities will be attending. The governor may even make an appearance. It's become something of a networking opportunity as well as a celebration. I nodded, waiting for him to continue, to reach the actual point hiding behind these preliminary statements. The venue really is quite limited in capacity, he went on, his eyes now fixed on his coffee cup rather than meeting mine. And the per-person cost is astronomical. We've had to make some very difficult decisions about the wedding party and featured family members. I see, I said evenly, though my heart had already begun to sink with the inevitable conclusion of this carefully constructed explanation. And what decision have you made about your mother's role? Michael exhaled slowly, finally looking up. We think it would be best if you attended as a guest, rather than having a formal role in the ceremony or reception. The wedding party will consist primarily of colleagues who Catherine and I work with daily. The parents' roles will be filled by Catherine's mother and father, who are well known in the medical community and have specific connections to the venue itself. I see, I repeated, the words feeling both foreign and painfully clear in their implication. So I will simply be seated somewhere among the general guests. It's not like that, he protested, though we both knew it was exactly like that. It's just that the event has a certain profile, a certain significance for our careers. Catherine's parents have connections with hospital leadership, research funding bodies, potential partners for our new private practice. Your new private practice? I asked. You haven't mentioned that before? Michael looked momentarily caught off guard, as though he'd revealed something prematurely. Yes, well, Catherine and I have been developing plans to open our own practice after the wedding. Her father has connections with several potential investors. It's very preliminary, but potentially very significant. I looked at my son, my only child, the boy I had raised with values of compassion, gratitude, and genuine human connection, and felt a profound sadness that went beyond my personal hurt at being sidelined. What I want for you, I said softly, is a life of meaning and authenticity. A life where you're valued for who you are and what you contribute to others' well-being, not for what connections you can provide. A life your father would recognize and be proud of. The mention of his father struck home. I could see it in the way Michael flinched slightly, in the momentary flash of shame that crossed his features before it was replaced by defensive irritation. Dad would have understood the importance of this opportunity, he said, though with less conviction than his previous statements. He was practical about career advancement. Your father was practical about making a positive difference in people's lives, I corrected gently. He measured success by lives improved, not by impressive connections. Michael stood abruptly, his barely touched dessert forgotten. I need to go. I have early hospital rounds tomorrow, and this conversation isn't productive. I hope you'll understand our decision and support this important step in our lives. As he moved toward the door, I remained seated, a strange calm settling over me despite the turmoil of emotions beneath the surface. Michael, I called as he reached for the doorknob. Just one question before you go. He turned, wariness evident in his stance. Yes? Has Catherine discussed the new medical ethics requirements for private practices with you? The ones being implemented by the state board next month? His brow furrowed in confusion. Briefly. Her father mentioned something about updated compliance. Protocols. Why? I nodded thoughtfully. Just curious. Drive safely, Michael. After he left, I sat alone in my dining room, surrounded by the remains of the dinner I had prepared with such care and hope. The pain of being marginalized was acute, a physical ache in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. But beneath, the hurt, another emotion was taking shape, a quiet, determined resolve that had carried me through other difficult chapters of my life. If Michael and Catherine had made their choice about my place in their celebration and their future, then perhaps it was time for me to make some choices of my own. Not out of vengeance or bitterness, but out of a profound commitment to the values I had spent my entire nursing career upholding: dignity, respect, and the fundamental understanding that true healing encompasses not just the body, but the spirit, and community as well. I picked up my phone and made a call to a number I used regularly, but for a purpose Michael clearly had no idea existed. When the woman answered, I introduced myself calmly. "Hello, Dr. Jameson. This is Virginia Winters, chairperson of the State Medical Ethics Board. I believe it's time we had a serious conversation about the new private practice application for Lakeside Integrative Medicine and its principal physicians, Dr. Michael Winters and Dr. Catherine Harrington." The wheels were now in motion, though Michael and Catherine had no idea what was coming. Sometimes, the most unexpected consequences arise not from malice, but from simple truth finally being allowed to emerge from shadow. And the truth about my role in the medical community was about to change everything about their perfect, carefully curated plans. The 3 weeks following my difficult dinner with Michael were deceptively normal on the surface. We exchanged brief text messages about mundane matters: his recommendation for a plumber when my kitchen faucet developed a leak, my updates about a community garden project I was coordinating, superficial pleasantries that carefully avoided any mention of the wedding or his upcoming private practice. Behind this facade of normalcy, however, I had set in motion a careful examination of Michael and Catherine's professional plans. To understand what happened next, I need to explain something about my position that Michael had apparently never fully grasped, despite my occasional mentions of my volunteer work with the State Medical Board. When I joined the Michigan State Medical Ethics Board 8 years ago, shortly after my retirement from full-time nursing, I saw it primarily as a way to continue contributing to healthcare quality in our state. What began as a modest commitment of 10 hours monthly gradually expanded as my unique perspective, decades of direct patient care combined with administrative experience, proved increasingly valuable to the board's deliberations. 3 years ago, when Dr. Eleanor Jameson, then chairperson, announced her retirement, she nominated me as her successor, a decision that surprised many in the medical establishment who expected another physician to take the role. "What this board needs," Dr. Jameson had said during the nomination process, "isn't another doctor with theoretical knowledge of ethics, but someone who has spent their career navigating the practical realities of patient care, where ethical principles are tested daily." My appointment was ultimately approved, though not without some resistance from certain hospital administrators who worried about a nurse having oversight of physician conduct. That resistance had largely faded as my leadership proved both fair and effective, focusing on patient welfare while respecting the challenges physicians face in modern healthcare environments. As chairperson, my responsibilities included reviewing applications for new medical practices, investigating ethical complaints, participating in medical licensing decisions, and helping develop state guidelines for various aspects of healthcare delivery. It was a position of significant influence, though exercised quietly and primarily behind closed doors. I had mentioned this role to Michael several times over the years, though always modestly, referring to it as my board work or healthcare volunteer position. In my mind, I wasn't being secretive, just maintaining the same humble approach to service that had characterized my nursing career. I never trumpeted my accomplishments or sought recognition, believing that good work spoke for itself. Now, as I reviewed the preliminary application for Lakeside Integrative Medicine that had recently been submitted to the board, I realized with growing concern how little Michael had shared with me about this venture, and how problematic certain aspects of their proposed practice appeared to be from an ethical standpoint. The application, bearing both Michael and Catherine's signatures, outlined a concierge medical practice with a minimum annual membership fee of $50,000 per family, promising exclusive access, personalized care, and priority services that struck me as potentially creating a two-tiered system of care that the ethics board had consistently opposed. More concerning were the proposed relationships with pharmaceutical companies providing research opportunities that appeared to blur the lines between patient care and drug development in ways that raised serious red flags. Most troubling was their staffing plan, which described a lean nursing model, with patient-to-nurse ratios far exceeding what research showed was safe for quality care. The nurses would be technically employed by a separate staffing company, one owned by Catherine's father, an arrangement that would allow the practice to circumvent certain labor regulations while maximizing physician profits. As I studied these documents in my home office, surrounded by the medical ethics textbooks and case studies I had accumulated over my years on the board, I felt a profound disappointment that went beyond my personal hurt at being excluded from Michael's wedding. This wasn't just about my son distancing himself from his unsophisticated mother. It was about him potentially abandoning the fundamental values of patient-centered care that I had worked so hard to instill in him. My call to Dr. Jameson, my predecessor and still an influential board member, hadn't been made in anger or for revenge. It had been the responsible action of an ethics chairperson who had identified significant concerns in a pending application. "Virginia," she had said after I outlined the issues, "this is exactly why you were the right choice for chairperson. You see these problems clearly because you've been on the front lines of patient care. How do you want to proceed, given your personal connection to the applicants?" "I'll recuse myself from the final vote, of course," I had replied. "But I believe I have a responsibility to ensure the full review process moves forward appropriately. The potential ethical issues here would concern me regardless of who submitted the application." "Agreed," she had said. "I'll assemble the review committee. Given the specific concerns, we should probably expedite rather than delay the process. Better to address these issues before they invest further in a model that may not receive approval." The next day, letters were sent to both Michael and Catherine, informing them that their practice application had been flagged for comprehensive ethical review and requesting their presence at a special committee meeting the following week. The letter didn't mention my involvement, not as an attempt at secrecy, but following standard protocol that kept individual committee members' concerns confidential during preliminary reviews. 2 days later, my doorbell rang at 7:30 in the evening. When I opened it, I found Michael standing on my porch, his face a storm of confusion and barely contained anger. "Mom," he said, dispensing with any greeting, "what do you know about this?" He thrust a piece of paper toward me, the ethics board letter I had been expecting. "Come in, Michael," I said calmly, stepping back to allow him entry. "We should talk about this properly." "There's nothing proper about it," he retorted, following me into the living room but remaining standing while I took a seat in my reading chair. "Our practice application has been singled out for comprehensive ethical review, when dozens of similar practices operate throughout the state without interference. I want to know if you had anything to do with this." I met his gaze steadily. "Yes, Michael, I did. As chairperson of the State Medical Ethics Board, I identified several concerning elements in your application that warrant further examination." His expression shifted from anger to disbelief. "Chairperson? You volunteer on some advisory committee. You've mentioned your board work occasionally, but I've been chairperson of the Michigan State Medical Ethics Board for 3 years, Michael," I explained quietly. "It's not an advisory committee. It's the regulatory body that oversees ethical compliance for all medical practitioners and facilities in our state. Before that, I was a regular member for 5 years." He sank slowly onto the couch, processing this information. "How did I not know this?" "I've mentioned my position several times," I replied. "Perhaps not with emphasis on its authority, but I've never hidden it. Last Christmas, I even told you about the new regulations we were developing for surgical centers, And you commented that Catherine's father had been complaining about some bureaucratic committee creating unnecessary hurdles. The memory visibly registered as his expression shifted again. "I thought you were just on some hospital volunteer board," he said weakly. "You never explained that your position was so influential," I suggested. "I've never been one to emphasize my authority, Michael. You know that. But the position carries significant responsibilities that I take very seriously, including reviewing new practice applications for ethical concerns." "And you found concerns with ours," he said, an edge returning to his voice. "Conveniently? Right after I told you about your limited role in the wedding." I sighed deeply, both hurt and disappointed by the accusation. "Michael, I've dedicated my entire professional life to healthcare ethics, first as a practicing nurse, now as a regulatory chairperson. Do you really believe I would compromise that integrity for personal revenge?" "I don't know what to believe." "Anymore?" he said. "This feels like too much of a coincidence." "The timing isn't a coincidence," I acknowledged. "But not for the reason you're suggesting. Until our dinner conversation, I had no idea you were planning to open a private practice. You never shared those plans with me. The application was submitted to the board last week, and as chairperson, I review all new submissions. That's when I first learned the details of what you and Catherine are planning." His eyes narrowed slightly. "And what exactly are your concerns? With our practice model? It's based on several successful concierge practices around the country." "I have several specific concerns," I said, rising to retrieve a folder from my desk in the corner of the room. "The extreme membership fee creating barriers to care, the pharmaceutical research arrangements that present clear conflicts of interest, the nursing staffing model that prioritizes profit over patient safety, and the corporate structure designed to circumvent labor regulations." I handed him the folder containing my preliminary notes. "These aren't personal objections, Michael. They're legitimate ethical issues that would concern me regardless of who submitted the application." He flipped through the papers, his medical training allowing him to quickly grasp the specific regulatory codes and research citations I had included. His expression shifted several times as he read, from defensive to thoughtful, from irritated to, surprisingly, slightly embarrassed. "These staffing ratios," he said finally, looking up from the papers. Catherine's father assured us they were industry standard for boutique practices." "They may be standard in some practices," I acknowledged, "but that doesn't make them ethical or safe. There's substantial research showing increased complication rates and poorer outcomes with ratios this high, particularly for the complex cases you're targeting. And this pharmaceutical arrangement," he continued, turning a page. "I thought it was just a standard research partnership." "The structure crosses several ethical boundaries," I explained. "Patients shouldn't be paying premium fees while simultaneously serving as research subjects, especially when the practicing physicians have direct financial interests in the research outcomes." For nearly an hour, we went through each concern point by point. As the discussion progressed, I saw glimpses of the thoughtful, ethically minded physician I had raised. Moments when Michael's genuine concern for patient welfare surfaced through the ambitious professional persona he had recently adopted. "I need time to think about all this," he said finally, closing the folder. "Some of these issues, I didn't fully understand the implications. Catherine's father handled most of the business planning. We trusted his experience." "That's understandable," I said gently. "Dr. Harrington is certainly experienced in building successful medical businesses. But success and ethics don't always align perfectly, and as the licensed physicians, you and Catherine bear the ultimate responsibility for your practice model." Michael stood to leave, his earlier anger replaced by a more complicated mix of emotions. "The committee meeting is next Tuesday," he said. "Will you be there?" "No," I replied. "I've recused myself from the vote due to our relationship. Dr. Jameson will chair the review committee in my place." "But Michael," I added as he moved toward the door, Regardless of what happens with the practice application, I hope you understand that this was never about the wedding. My professional ethics aren't conditional on personal treatment. He paused at the door, not quite meeting my eyes. I need to talk to Catherine about all this. The practice model it's central to our plans, to everything we've been building toward. I understand, I said. But remember that a medical practice should first and foremost reflect your values as a physician, not just your business aspirations. After he left, I sat alone in my living room, uncertain whether our conversation had bridged the growing distance between us or widened it further. I had done what was professionally necessary, what my position and principles required. But I couldn't deny the pain of seeing disappointment in my son's eyes, even if that disappointment stemmed from his discovery that I wouldn't compromise my ethics, even for him. The following days brought no communication from Michael. The wedding was now just 7 weeks away, and the silence regarding my role continued. I focused on my garden, my community work, and my duties with the ethics board, all the while carrying a heavy awareness that my relationship with my only child hung in a precarious balance. 5 days after Michael's visit, my doorbell rang again, this time at mid-morning on a Saturday. When I opened it, I was surprised to find Catherine standing on my porch, impeccably dressed as always, but with an uncharacteristic tension visible around her eyes. "Virginia," she said with formal politeness, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I was hoping we might talk." "Of course," I replied, stepping back to invite her in. "Would you like some tea? I've just made a pot." "That would be nice, thank you." I led her to the kitchen, rather than the more formal living room, a deliberate choice to create a more personal atmosphere. As I poured tea into my mismatched collection of thrift store teacups, so different from the coordinated fine china Catherine undoubtedly preferred, I noted how carefully she examined my modest home, her eyes lingering on the hand-knitted afghan draped over my reading chair, the collection of nursing conference photos on my refrigerator, the worn but well-tended garden visible through the kitchen window. "Your home is very cozy," she said, accepting the teacup I offered. "It has character." "Thank you," I replied, recognizing both the genuine observation and the subtle condescension within it. "It suits me. I've never needed much space or luxury to feel at home." We sat at my small kitchen table, an awkward silence stretching between us before Catherine finally spoke. "Michael told me about your position on the ethics board," she began, her tone carefully neutral. "I have to admit I was surprised. You've always spoken of your post-retirement activities so modestly." "That's my nature," I said simply. "I've never felt the need to emphasize titles or authority. The work itself has always been what matters to me." She nodded slightly, taking a small sip of tea before continuing. "Michael also shared your concerns about our practice model. We've been reconsidering certain aspects in light of the issues you raised." This admission surprised me, though I tried not to show it. "I'm glad to hear that. The concerns are substantive, but not insurmountable with appropriate modifications." "My father disagrees," she said, a fleeting expression of frustration crossing her features. "He believes the model works exactly as designed, and that your intervention is personally motivated." "I suspected he might see it that way," I acknowledged. "But the ethical issues would exist regardless of who identified them. The review committee includes 5 physicians and 2 attorneys who have no personal connection to either of us. They'll evaluate the application purely on its merits." Catherine set down her teacup with precise movements. "Virginia, I'll be direct. We need this practice to move forward. Michael and I have already invested significantly in the planning stages. More importantly, we've leveraged these plans for positions on hospital committees, research partnerships, and social connections that are crucial to our future. I understand the stakes are high for you," I said carefully. "But surely those connections shouldn't depend entirely on a specific practice model, especially one with ethical concerns." Your and Michael's medical expertise and contributions would remain valuable regardless. She gave me a look that suggested I was being naive. In our circles, Virginia, perception and positioning matter enormously. We've presented ourselves as the founders of an exclusive, innovative practice. If we have to significantly alter that vision now, it will be seen as a failure of judgment at best, an ethical lapse at worst. Either way, the damage to our professional standing would be considerable. I took a moment to truly consider her perspective. Catherine had been raised in a world where professional status and social position were inextricably linked, where the appearance of success often mattered as much as its substance. While I didn't share these values, I could at least recognize their reality in her life. "What is it you're asking of me, Catherine?" I inquired directly. She straightened slightly, her composed demeanor returning. "I'm asking if there's a way forward that allows our practice to proceed while addressing your concerns. A compromise that preserves the exclusive concierge nature of our model while satisfying the ethical requirements." The request was reasonable on its surface. Finding such compromises was indeed part of the board's work. But something in her phrasing troubled me. The board doesn't exist to find loopholes, Catherine. Its purpose is to ensure ethical patient care. Any modifications would need to genuinely address the substantive issues, not just technically comply while maintaining problematic practices. "Of course," she said quickly, though something in her eyes suggested this wasn't the answer she had hoped for. "We're prepared to make real changes. In fact, Michael has already revised the nursing staffing plan to align with recommended ratios." This information lifted my spirits slightly. That's an important step. The pharmaceutical arrangements and fee structure would still need significant adjustment, but it's a start toward a more ethical model. Catherine hesitated, then took a different approach. "Virginia, I know we haven't always connected as well as you might have hoped. Our backgrounds and perspectives are quite different. But Michael values you deeply, and I respect that. I want us to find a way forward that works for everyone." The olive branch, however calculated, seemed genuine in its own way. Catherine was trying, within the limitations of her worldview and priorities, to build a bridge between us. "I appreciate that, Catherine," I said sincerely. "And I want you to know that my professional concerns about the practice are entirely separate from any personal feelings about my role in your wedding or in your lives. Even if we were the closest of friends, I would still have identified these same ethical issues." A flicker of something, respect perhaps, crossed her features before she responded. "That's admirable, though it would certainly be easier if personal and professional concerns could be resolved together." Her implication was clear. Reconsider the practice application, and perhaps my role in the wedding might be reconsidered as well. The transactional nature of this unstated offer saddened me deeply. "Ethics aren't negotiable, Catherine," I said, quietly. "Not for wedding invitations, not for family harmony, not for anything. That's a principle I've lived by throughout my career, and it's one I hope to instill in Michael." She studied me for a long moment, as though truly seeing me clearly for the first time. "You really aren't what I expected," she finally said. When Michael described his nurse mother living in this modest home, volunteering at community clinics, gardening as a hobby, I created a certain picture in my mind. "And what was that picture?" I asked. "Someone simple," she admitted. "Kind but limited in perspective. Someone whose world was small and whose influence was local at best." She gestured vaguely around the kitchen. "This life seems so contained, so different from the connections and influence we've built." "Appearances can be deceiving," I said, without rancor. "A small home doesn't indicate a small mind or limited impact. Some of the most influential work happens quietly, without impressive titles or surroundings." Catherine nodded slowly, finishing her tea before speaking again. "The review committee meets on Tuesday. What should we expect?" An honest but fair evaluation, I replied. If you and Michael have already begun addressing the concerns, particularly the staffing issues, that will certainly work in your favor. Come prepared to discuss substantial modifications to the other problematic elements. The committee isn't opposed to concierge medicine in principle, only to models that compromise patient welfare or exploit regulatory loopholes. As Catherine prepared to leave, she paused at the door with an expression of genuine curiosity. May I ask you something? Virginia, without professional considerations or personal tensions, just honest curiosity? Of course. If the roles were reversed, if it were my mother who had ethical concerns about a project important to me, I would still expect her to support me publicly, to set aside professional objections for the sake of family loyalty. Why doesn't that factor into your thinking at all? The question revealed so much about our different worldviews that I took a moment to consider my response carefully. Because I believe the greatest act of love isn't blind support, Catherine. It's holding those we care about to the highest standards of integrity, especially when doing so is difficult. I didn't raise Michael to prioritize success over ethics or family loyalty over professional responsibility. I raised him to understand that true integrity means making the same ethical choices whether or not anyone is watching, whether or not they benefit you personally. She absorbed this without immediate comment, her expression thoughtful as she thanked me for the tea and departed. Whether my words had any impact on her perspective remained to be seen, but for the first time since we'd met, I felt we had engaged in a genuine conversation rather than a careful social performance. The days leading up to the review committee, meeting passed without further communication from either Michael or Catherine. I continued my normal activities while privately wondering what approach they would take with the committee, whether they would make substantive changes to their practice model or attempt to circumvent the ethical concerns with superficial modifications. Tuesday morning arrived clear and crisp, a beautiful autumn day that belied the tension I felt as I deliberately occupied myself with garden work, while the committee met at the state medical board offices downtown. Though I had recused myself from the proceedings, I couldn't help checking my phone periodically, wondering what was happening in that conference room where my son's professional plans were being evaluated by his peers. At 2:17 p.m., my phone rang. Dr. Jameson calling from the board offices. Virginia, she began without preamble. I thought you should hear this directly from me. Your son and Dr. Harrington have withdrawn their application for Lakeside Integrative Medicine. This was not the outcome I had expected. Withdrawn completely? Not modified or revised? Completely withdrawn, she confirmed. Dr. Winters, Michael, made the announcement at the beginning of the session, said they had reconsidered their practice model and determined that it didn't fully align with their core values as physicians. Quite refreshing, actually. Most applicants with ethical concerns fight tooth and nail or make minimal adjustments. Did they indicate their plans going forward? I asked, trying to process this unexpected development. Not specifically, Dr. Jameson replied, though your son did mention they would be developing a new model that better balanced business viability with ethical patient care. He seemed different from the impression I got from the application. More thoughtful, less focused on exclusivity and profit. After ending the call, I sat on my garden bench, surrounded by the autumn flowers I had just finished tending, and tried to understand what this development might mean. Withdrawal of the application was simultaneously a professional setback for Michael and Catherine, and potentially a moral victory, a recognition that their original plans had indeed compromised important ethical principles. Whether this change of heart would extend to their personal treatment of me remained to be seen. The wedding was still 6 weeks away, my role still undefined, the distance between us still significant. But for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope that the son I had raised, the compassionate, ethical physician who valued human dignity above status or profit, might be finding his way back to his core values. That evening, as dusk settled over my garden and I prepared for a quiet dinner alone, my doorbell rang once more. When I opened it, I found Michael standing on my porch, alone this time, his expression a complex mixture of exhaustion, resignation, and something that looked surprisingly like the beginning of clarity. "Mom," he said simply, "can we talk?" "Would you like some tea?" I asked Michael as he stepped inside, shrugging off his light jacket. The formality of the question felt strange given all we had shared, yet somehow appropriate for this moment that seemed balanced between familiar intimacy and newfound distance. "That would be nice," he replied, following me to the kitchen with the careful movements of someone navigating unfamiliar territory, though he had spent his childhood running through these very rooms. I busied myself with the kettle and teapot, grateful for the small ritual that gave my hands something to do while my mind raced with questions. Michael sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had done homework, where we had shared countless meals, where I had first helped him fill out his medical school applications. Now he looked almost too large for the space, his professional posture and tailored clothing incongruous against the well-worn familiarity of my kitchen. When I finally placed a steaming mug before him, in the chipped Michigan medical school mug I'd kept all these years, he wrapped his hands around it but didn't drink. "We withdrew our application today," he said, stating what I already knew but clearly needing to begin somewhere. "Dr. Jameson called me," I acknowledged. "She seemed surprised by your decision." "We surprised ourselves," he admitted with a small, rueful smile. "Catherine and I spent the entire weekend reviewing the practice model, starting with your concerns, but eventually identifying even more issues as we dug deeper. The more we examined it, the less it aligned with the kind of medicine either of us originally wanted to practice." I sat across from him, cradling my own tea. "That couldn't have been an easy conclusion to reach, given your investment in the plans." "It wasn't," he confirmed. "Especially for Catherine. Her father, well, he's not taking the withdrawal well. He had leveraged significant connections to arrange financing and partnerships." "I imagine he blames me," I said quietly. Michael met my eyes directly for the first time since entering the house. "He does. He called you a small-town nurse playing at authority and suggested we find a way to proceed despite the ethics review. The description stung slightly, though. It wasn't far from how Catherine had initially portrayed me." "And what did you tell him?" "That he was wrong about you. That your position wasn't the issue. The ethical problems with our model were real and significant." Michael took a sip of his tea before continuing. "I also told him something I should have made clear to him months ago, that Catherine and I make our own professional decisions, not him." This assertion of independence surprised me. How did he respond to that? "Poorly," Michael admitted with a grimace. "He suggested that Catherine's engagement ring might need to be returned if we weren't going to follow the career path he'd envisioned for us." "Oh, Michael," I said, genuinely distressed. "I never intended to create such conflict between you and Catherine's family." "You didn't create it, Mom," he said firmly. "You just brought it into the open. The control, the expectations, the assumption that we would prioritize status and profit over proper patient care. Those were already there, just masked by promises of success and influence." He fell silent for a moment, staring into his tea as though gathering his thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice carried a vulnerability I hadn't heard in years. "When I first started seeing Catherine, I was dazzled. Not just by her, though she is brilliant and driven in ways that genuinely impress me, but by her world, the connections, the influence, the ease with which doors opened. It felt like everything I'd worked for, everything you'd sacrificed to help me achieve, was finally being recognized and valued." He looked up, meeting my eyes with newfound clarity. "But there was a cost I didn't recognize at first. With every dinner at the country club, every weekend at their lake house, every introduction to another important connection, I moved further from the reasons I wanted to become a doctor in the first place." Which were? I asked softly, though I knew the answer, had heard it from him countless times throughout his childhood and education. To help people heal, he said simply. Not just the wealthy or well-connected, not as a path to status or influence, but because it's meaningful work that makes a genuine difference in people's lives. His voice strengthened as he continued. The practice model we withdrew today, it wasn't designed to fulfill that purpose. It was designed to maximize profit while minimizing actual care obligations. The kind of medicine that looks impressive at cocktail parties but fails patients when they're most vulnerable. I felt a complex emotion rising in my chest. Pride in his recognition of these fundamental truths, sorrow for the painful path that had led him back to them, hope that this clarity might persist beyond the current moment of crisis. What happens now? I asked. With your practice plans? With Catherine? We're starting over, he said, a determined set to his jaw. Professionally, we're developing a new practice model, one that includes concierge elements for sustainability, but also allocates 30% of our clinical hours to community care for underserved populations. Catherine actually proposed that component after her conversation with you last week. This information genuinely surprised me. Catherine suggested community service hours? Michael nodded. She said something you told her had stuck with her, about the greatest impact often happening quietly, without impressive surroundings or recognition. She's been different since talking with you. More reflective, more willing to question the values she was raised with. And her father's reaction to this new direction? He's withdrawn his financial support, Michael acknowledged. But we've secured alternate funding through University Hospital's community outreach program. It's a smaller start than we initially planned, but ultimately more aligned with what we both went into medicine to do. He hesitated before continuing. As for Catherine and me personally, we're postponing the wedding. This announcement caught me off guard. Postponing? Michael, that's not what I would want. Despite our differences, I would never wish to disrupt your happiness. It's not because of you, Mom, he assured me. It's because we both realized we were rushing toward this elaborate, status-focused celebration without having fully aligned our values and priorities. The practice application was a wake-up call. If we could develop a business model so far removed from our core values as physicians, what else might we be compromising without fully recognizing it? I absorbed this with mixed emotions, concern for my son's happiness, yet respect for the maturity this decision reflected. How did Catherine feel about postponing? It was actually her suggestion, he said, surprising me once again. After withdrawing the application yesterday, we had a long, honest conversation about everything. Our practice plans, our relationship with her parents, our treatment of you. She admitted something I think was difficult for her, that she's been following a script for success that her parents established without ever really questioning whether it aligned with her own values. He leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. Mom, I need to apologize to you. The way I've treated you these past months, minimizing your role in my life, excluding you from wedding planning, dismissing your professional accomplishments, it was inexcusable. I got caught up in a world that measures worth by status and connections, and in the process, I devalued the most important connection in my life. The sincerity in his voice brought tears to my eyes, though I tried to blink them away. We all lose perspective sometimes, Michael. What matters is finding our way back. There's something else, he continued, reaching for the messenger bag he had brought with him and removing a folder. Catherine and I spent today developing a new practice model, one we believe addresses all the ethical concerns while remaining financially viable. Before we submit anything officially, I'd like your perspective, not as ethics board chairperson, but as the person who taught me what compassionate healthcare really means. He handed me the folder, and I was struck by this gesture of respect for my professional judgment, so different from his dismissive attitude just weeks earlier. As I began reviewing the documents, I saw immediately that this was no superficial revision. The new model maintained the personalized care aspect of concierge medicine while eliminating the excessive fees that created barriers to access. The pharmaceutical research component had been restructured to prevent conflicts of interest, and the nursing staffing plan now exceeded recommended standards rather than barely meeting minimum requirements. Most impressively, they had incorporated a sliding scale payment system and dedicated pro bono hours that would make their specialized care available to patients regardless of financial status. It was a thoughtful, innovative approach that balanced business sustainability with genuine ethical care. "This is remarkable," I said, looking up from the papers. "A truly patient-centered model that also respects the professionals providing the care. You and Catherine developed this just since yesterday." Michael nodded, a hint of his old enthusiasm returning. "Once we stopped trying to maximize profit and status, the solutions came naturally. We kept asking ourselves what would best serve our patients while honoring our oath as physicians. The model practically designed itself from there." "You should be very proud of this," I told him sincerely. "It reflects the kind of physician I always knew you could be." "I have you to thank for that foundation," he said quietly. Even when I lost sight of it temporarily. We continued discussing the practice model for another hour, the conversation flowing more naturally as old patterns of intellectual exchange reasserted themselves. For the first time in months, I felt I was truly talking with my son, not the polished professional persona he had adopted, but the thoughtful, ethically minded physician I had raised. As our discussion wound down, Michael hesitated before broaching another subject. "Mom, there's something else Catherine and I have been reconsidering. When we postponed the wedding, we canceled the rooftop venue reservation. If and when we do reschedule, we'd like to have a much smaller, more meaningful ceremony. Perhaps here in your garden, if you'd be willing." The suggestion took me completely by surprise. "My garden? But it's so simple compared to what you'd planned. That's exactly why it feels right," he explained. "Your garden represents something that's been missing from our plans. Genuine care sustained over time, beauty that comes from daily attention rather than purchased perfection, a space that reflects real values rather than status or exhibition." I was deeply moved by this shift in perspective, though practical concerns immediately surfaced. Catherine's parents would surely object to such a modest venue. "They probably will," Michael acknowledged. "But Catherine is rethinking her relationship with them, particularly her father's controlling influence over her choices. She may need your guidance with that process, if you'd be willing. She's never had a model for standing firm in her values when they conflict with family expectations. Unlike you," I observed with gentle irony, "who had the model of a mother willing to identify ethical concerns in her own son's business plans, regardless of the personal cost." He smiled ruefully. "Exactly. It's strange. What I initially saw as a betrayal, Catherine has come to see as integrity worth emulating. She mentioned admiring how you've lived your values consistently, without compromise or apology. This assessment from Catherine, of all people, was perhaps the most surprising development of the evening. The polished, status-conscious woman who had viewed me as an embarrassing reminder of Michael's humble origins now apparently saw something in my life worthy of respect. "Michael," I said carefully, "I'm deeply touched by these changes in perspective. But I hope you and Catherine aren't overcompensating out of guilt or reaction. Finding your own authentic path doesn't need to mean rejecting everything from the life you've been building." "We've discussed that concern," he assured me. "This isn't about sweeping from one extreme to another. It's about consciously examining our choices rather than automatically following expectations, whether those come from Catherine's family's emphasis on status or my reaction against it." As the evening concluded and Michael prepared to leave, I felt a cautious hope that hadn't been present in our relationship for months. The distance between us hadn't vanished. Too much had happened for an instant restoration, but a bridge was forming across that distance, built from renewed respect and shared values. "I'll keep you updated on our revised practice application," Michael promised at the door. And Mom? Thank you for not compromising your ethics, even when it would have been easier for everyone. I needed that reminder of who I really am and what truly matters in the work I've chosen. After he left, I sat in my garden as twilight settled. Around me, reflecting on the unexpected turns this conflict had taken. What had begun as painful exclusion, my son and his fiancée viewing me as a burden to be minimized, had evolved into something far more complex, a catalyst for genuine reconsideration of values and priorities that might ultimately strengthen their relationship and their medical practice. I had not set out to display power or force recognition of my influence. I had simply continued doing what I had always done, upholding ethical standards and living my values consistently, whether in the hospital wards of my nursing days or the regulatory offices of my current position. The power that had so surprised Michael and Catherine wasn't about authority or control, but about the quiet strength that comes from unwavering commitment to principles that matter. Medium shot, Virginia's garden, 2 weeks later. The golden light of late afternoon filtered through autumn leaves as I knelt in my garden, preparing the beds for the approaching winter. This had always been my favorite time in the garden, not the showy blooms of summer, but the thoughtful preparation for seasons to come, the careful tending that would ensure renewed growth after the necessary dormancy ahead. The sound of car doors closing drew my attention to the driveway, where Michael and Catherine were emerging from her sleek silver sedan. Their visit wasn't unexpected. Michael had texted earlier asking if they could stop by, but seeing Catherine step carefully across my lawn in practical flats, rather than her usual heels, registered as yet another small but significant shift. "Your timing is perfect," I called, rising from my gardening work and removing my gloves. "I just put a fresh apple cake in the oven." "Mom's apple cake?" Michael explained to Catherine with evident enthusiasm. "It's a family tradition every fall. The recipe came from my grandmother, who got it from her mother." "It sounds wonderful," Catherine replied, with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than polite accommodation. "My family doesn't have many food traditions. Most celebrations involved catered events rather than home cooking." I led them inside, excusing myself briefly to wash away the garden soil before joining them at the kitchen table. As I served tea while waiting for the cake to finish baking, I noticed subtle changes in both their appearances. Michael's designer watch had been replaced by his father's old Timex that I'd given him after graduation. Catherine's expertly highlighted hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her makeup minimal compared to her usual perfect application. "We have some news," Michael began once we were settled. "Our revised practice model was approved by the ethics board yesterday. We're moving forward with Lakeside Community Medicine, a new name to reflect our shifted priorities." "That's wonderful," I said sincerely. "Congratulations to you both." The committee specifically commended the community service component and sliding scale payment structure, Catherine added, a note of genuine pride in her voice. Dr. Jameson mentioned it could become a model for other practices seeking to balance concierge elements with broader community access. "We've already secured our first location," Michael continued. "It's not the prestigious downtown address we originally planned, but it's actually more practical, right between the university, medical center, and the community that will benefit most from our sliding scale services." As they shared more details about their plans, I was struck by the balanced enthusiasm they both displayed. Catherine as engaged with the community service aspects as Michael, neither of them focusing on status or connections as they had in previous conversations about their professional future. When the oven timer sounded, I rose to retrieve the cake, its warm cinnamon apple scent filling the kitchen. As I served slices on my mismatched collection of dessert plates, so different from the coordinated fine china Catherine had originally selected for their wedding registry, I noticed her studying the kitchen with new eyes. "Your home has such character, Virginia," she said, echoing her comment from our previous conversation, but with a notably different tone. Every item seems to have a story or purpose. It feels authentic. Most things here do have stories, I acknowledged. That teapot was a gift from my first nursing cohort when I earned my master's degree. The quilt on that chair was made by a patient's grandmother after I helped her grandson through a difficult treatment. This table has hosted everything from Michael's science projects to community meeting planning to holiday dinners for nurses who couldn't travel home. Our condo is the opposite, Catherine admitted with surprising frankness. Everything was selected to create a specific impression, coordinated by an interior designer my mother recommended. Nothing really reflects our actual lives or values. She turned to Michael with an expression I hadn't seen before, vulnerability mixed with determination. I think we should tell Virginia about our decision. Michael nodded, setting down his fork and taking a deep breath. Mom, Catherine and I have been doing a lot of thinking since our conversation 2 weeks ago about our relationship, our practice, and our priorities. We've made some significant decisions. I waited, wondering what this new development might entail. We're still postponing the wedding, he continued, but not just as a reaction to recent events. We're taking a deliberate step back to ensure our relationship is built on genuine alignment, rather than shared ambitions or family expectations. Catherine picked up the thread. Part of that process involves me establishing clearer boundaries with my parents, particularly my father. I've spent my entire life following their definition of success without questioning whether it aligned with my own values. That's not an easy pattern to change, I observed, impressed by her self-awareness. No, it isn't, she agreed, which is why I've started working with a therapist to understand these patterns and develop healthier responses, and also why. She hesitated briefly before continuing. I wanted to ask if you might be willing to meet with me occasionally, not as Michael's mother or as the ethics board chairperson, but as someone who has consistently lived according to her own values despite external pressures. The request caught me completely off guard. This woman who had once viewed me as an embarrassment, as someone not sophisticated enough to fully include in her wedding plans, was now asking for my guidance in her personal development. I'd be honored, I said after a moment, genuinely, moved by the vulnerability this request represented. Though I'm hardly perfect in living my values, I've made plenty of mistakes along the way. But you acknowledge those mistakes and learn from them, Catherine said with surprising insight. You don't just maintain appearances regardless of the reality beneath. That's not how I was raised. Michael reached over to squeeze her hand supportively before addressing me again. There's more, Mom. We've also made some decisions about our living situation. We're selling the downtown condo and looking for something simpler, closer to our new practice location. Somewhere that can be a home rather than a showcase. And we'd like your input, Catherine added. Not just on the practical aspects, but on creating a space that reflects genuine values rather than status. I've never really had that model. As our conversation continued through the afternoon and into early evening, I witnessed something I had begun to doubt I would ever see. A genuine connection forming between myself and Catherine, based not on social obligation or family courtesy, but on actual respect and shared purpose. The polished veneer that had always characterized her interaction was gradually giving way to something more authentic, revealing a thoughtful woman who had been raised to prioritize appearance over substance, but was now questioning those lessons. When they finally prepared to leave, Catherine surprised me with a tentative hug, the first genuine physical contact we had shared in the 2 years since Michael had introduced us. Thank you, Virginia, she said quietly. Not just for today, but for standing firm in your ethics even when it would have been easier not to. I've never had many models for that kind of integrity. After they departed, I returned to my garden to finish the work I had begun earlier, my mind processing the remarkable shifts that had occurred in recent weeks. The painful exclusion that had sparked this journey, being viewed as a burden by my son's partner, being marginalized in their wedding plans, had transformed into something entirely unexpected, a catalyst for genuine growth and reevaluation of priorities for all of us. I had not set out to show Catherine how powerful I could be. I had simply continued living according to the principles that had guided my entire professional life: integrity, compassion, and respect for human dignity. The true power wasn't in my position on the ethics board or in my capacity to challenge their practice plans. It lay in the consistent application of values that ultimately offered something Catherine had never experienced despite her privileged upbringing: authentic purpose beyond status or appearance. As twilight settled over my garden, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected path this conflict had taken. What might have become a permanent estrangement had instead opened the possibility for deeper, more meaningful connections, not by forcing others to acknowledge my authority, but by demonstrating through lived example the quiet strength of unwavering principles. The journey ahead would not be without challenges. Catherine's parents would likely continue to resist the changes in their daughter's priorities. The medical establishment might view their innovative practice model with skepticism. The path of authentic values over superficial success rarely came without obstacles. But watching the genuine evolution in both Michael and Catherine over these past weeks had given me renewed faith in the power of living one's truth consistently, not as a weapon to wield or a position to defend, but as a quiet invitation to deeper understanding. Sometimes the most profound influence doesn't come from asserting power, but from simply embodying the values we wish to see in the world around us. As darkness fell and I gathered my gardening tools, I smiled at the irony that had unfolded. The daughter-in-law who had once seen me as a burden, an unsophisticated nurse whose modest life represented everything she hoped to rise above, now sought my guidance in building a more authentic life. The power she had finally recognized wasn't about authority or control, but about the quiet strength that comes from knowing who you are and standing firmly in that truth, regardless of external pressures or expectations. That was a lesson worth learning, regardless of what path their future might take. Spring had transformed my garden once again, the patient work of autumn and the quiet dormancy of winter yielding to new growth and vibrant color. The perennials I had carefully divided and replanted last fall were now emerging with renewed vigor, a testament to the cycle of renewal that had always given me such profound satisfaction. 1 year had passed since that pivotal confrontation over Michael and Catherine's private practice plans, a year of remarkable changes and unexpected growth for all of us. The practice that had once been envisioned as Lakeside Integrative Medicine, an exclusive high-profit venture catering to wealthy clients, had been reimagined and reborn as Lakeside Community Medicine. Their revised model maintained elements of personalized care while incorporating sliding scale fees, community service hours, and ethical treatment protocols. What had begun as a crisis sparked by my ethics review had evolved into something neither Michael nor Catherine could have initially imagined: a practice that honored their medical expertise while serving a broader community with genuine care. The sound of car doors and cheerful voices drew my attention to the driveway, where Michael and Catherine were unloading supplies from their vehicle. Today was a significant occasion: the official 1-year anniversary of Lakeside Community Medicine, the practice they had built from the ethical foundations we had discussed at my kitchen table. "Mom, we brought everything for the celebration," Michael called, carrying bags of groceries toward the house. Catherine's handling the special surprise. I set aside my gardening tools and rose to greet them, struck once again by the changes a year had brought, not just in circumstances but in the people themselves. Michael moved with a relaxed confidence so different from the tense, status-conscious demeanor he had adopted during his early relationship with Catherine. Even more remarkable was Catherine's transformation. She navigated my uneven garden path, carrying a large bakery box, looking completely at ease in surroundings she would have once viewed with barely concealed disdain. Her appearance remained impeccable, but the polished perfection that had once seemed like armor had softened into something more authentic. "Virginia, the garden looks absolutely beautiful," she said warmly, giving me a genuine hug despite the awkward box in her arms. "Those new varieties we planted last fall are thriving." The we registered pleasantly. Catherine had indeed joined me for several gardening sessions over the past year, initially as a curious observer, but eventually as an enthusiastic participant. What had begun as a tentative gesture toward connection had evolved into a genuine shared interest. Inside the house, which had once seemed so modest and unremarkable to Catherine's status-conscious eyes, comfortable familiarity had replaced awkward formality. She moved through my kitchen with ease, knowing where utensils and serving dishes were kept, how the temperamental oven needed an extra 5 minutes to reach proper temperature, which cabinet held the special occasion glasses. "Dr. Jameson and the other board members should be here around 4, Michael said, consulting his phone calendar. The hospital administrator and community clinic director confirmed yesterday. Today's gathering was both a celebration and a milestone. Presentation, the 1-year results of their innovative practice model being shared with healthcare leaders from across the region. What had begun as a personal ethical crisis had evolved into a potential template for other practices seeking to balance financial viability with genuine community service. Everything ready for your presentation? I asked, helping them unpack. The groceries? I think so, Catherine replied. The patient outcome data is particularly compelling. Our sliding scale patients show adherence and improvement rates nearly identical to our full-fee patients, completely contradicting the assumptions my father and his colleagues always made about community care being less effective. She opened the bakery box to reveal a beautiful cake decorated with the Lakeside Community Medicine logo. Our office staff insisted on having this made. They're so proud of what we've accomplished this year. As they should be, I said, admiring both the cake and the evident satisfaction in Catherine's expression. Building something meaningful is always more satisfying than creating something merely impressive. That's precisely what I've been learning, she acknowledged. When we first designed the original practice, all our discussions centered around how others would perceive it, the prestige, the exclusivity, the status it would confer. Now we actually talk about patient outcomes, staff satisfaction, and ethical care models. The difference in how that feels is remarkable. The mention of her father came without the tension that had once accompanied it. Catherine's relationship with her parents had been perhaps the most challenging aspect of the past year's transformation. Dr. Harrington had initially responded to their changed plans with anger and attempts at control, threatening everything from financial disinheritance to professional ostracism. Catherine's mother had taken a more passive-aggressive approach, expressing wounded disappointment over their reduced circumstances. "How are things with your parents now?" I asked. "Evolving," she said thoughtfully. Dad actually asked to see our 1-year data last week. He didn't say much afterward, but he didn't immediately dismiss it either. Mom's been slightly more receptive since she visited the practice and saw that it's not the charity clinic disaster she had imagined. "Speaking of evolving perspectives," Catherine said, turning to me with evident excitement, "should we tell Virginia our news?" Michael nodded, his expression reflecting both joy and a touch of nervousness. "We've set a new date for our wedding, September 15th, if that works with your schedule. We'd like to have it here in your garden, as we discussed last year, just a small gathering of people who truly matter to us." Though they had mentioned this possibility during our conversations months ago, hearing it confirmed as an actual plan sent a wave of emotion through me. "Of course it works with my schedule," I replied warmly. "Nothing could be more important. But are you certain this is what you both want? A small garden wedding is quite different from what you originally envisioned." "That's precisely why it feels right," Catherine said with surprising conviction. "The elaborate event we planned before wasn't about celebrating our relationship. It was about showcasing status and collecting professional connections. She gestured around my modest kitchen. This authenticity, this focus on what genuinely matters, is what we want to build our marriage around. My only concern is your parents, I said gently to Catherine. Will they accept something so different from their expectations? A flash of old pain crossed Catherine's expression, quickly replaced by calm resolve. I hope they will. I've invited them to be part of this new vision, but I've also been clear that the decision is ultimately ours. That's been the hardest lesson of this year, learning that I can love them while refusing to sacrifice my authenticity to meet their expectations. By 4 o'clock, my modest backyard had transformed into a gathering space for some of the most influential healthcare leaders in our region. The purpose today was substantive exchange about an innovative medical practice model that could potentially reshape community care standards. Dr. Eleanor Jameson, my colleague and predecessor as Ethics Board chairperson, arrived promptly at 4, bringing with her the hospital CEO and several physicians interested in adapting elements of the Lakeside model. The community clinic director came with her administrative team, eager to discuss how the sliding scale system had been implemented so effectively. Virginia, this is remarkable data, Dr. Jameson said, joining me at the refreshment table after her conversation. Your son and Dr. Harrington have developed something genuinely innovative here, a true middle path between traditional practice, limitations, and concierge excesses. They've worked incredibly hard, I acknowledged, not just on the practice model, but on aligning their professional choices with their core values. That alignment shows, she observed thoughtfully. I remember reviewing their original application, technically proficient but fundamentally misaligned with ethical patient care. The contrast between that and what they've built now is stark. The gathering was shifting toward its formal presentation when an unexpected visitor arrived. I noticed Catherine suddenly stiffen, her eyes fixed on the garden entrance where an elegant older woman stood uncertainly, looking slightly out of place in her designer suit and careful makeup. "Mom?" Catherine whispered, surprise evident in her voice before she quickly made her way across the garden. I watched their interaction from a distance, the tentative greeting, Catherine's gesture of welcome, her mother's careful survey of the gathering before accepting a glass of lemonade. Not a dramatic reconciliation, but a small, significant step beyond the strained politeness that had characterized their interactions over the past year. The formal presentation began with Michael, welcoming everyone and explaining the journey that had led to Lakeside Community Medicine's creation. With remarkable honesty, he acknowledged the ethical concerns that had been raised about their original model and the transformation in thinking that had followed. What began as an ethics review that felt personally devastating ultimately became the foundation for the most meaningful work of our careers, he explained. We had to confront uncomfortable truths about the practice model we designed, that it prioritized profit over patient welfare, status over service, exclusivity over ethical care. Catherine continued the presentation, sharing detailed data about their first year of operation. The statistics were impressive by any standard. High patient satisfaction scores, excellent clinical outcomes, strong financial sustainability despite the sliding scale model, and remarkably low staff turnover compared to industry averages. When the formal portion concluded and guests broke into smaller discussion groups, Elizabeth Harrington approached me directly for perhaps the first meaningful conversation of our acquaintance. "Your garden is lovely," she said, her tone suggesting genuine appreciation rather than polite obligation. "Catherine mentioned you taught her about dividing perennials last fall. She's actually started a small container garden on their balcony. She has a natural touch with plants," I replied. Once she stopped worrying about doing it perfectly, she developed a good instinct for what they need. A flicker of recognition crossed Elizabeth's carefully composed features. "That observation might apply to more than gardening," she acknowledged quietly. "Robert and we've always emphasized perfection over process, results over experience." Elizabeth. studied me with new attention, her practiced social mask momentarily dropping to reveal genuine curiosity. Catherine speaks of you differently now. When they first got engaged, she described you as sweet but simple, her diplomatic way of suggesting you weren't sophisticated enough for their social circle. Now she mentions your wisdom, your integrity, your clarity of purpose. She shook her head slightly. I admit I was skeptical. I couldn't understand what insights a retired nurse in a modest home could offer my daughter that her father and I hadn't already provided. And now? I asked gently. Now I see that what you offered wasn't more information or advantages, but a different way of measuring value entirely. She gestured toward where Catherine and Michael were engaged in animated conversation with several physicians. She's different, less perfectly polished, but more genuinely present. Their practice isn't what we envisioned, yet they speak about their work with a satisfaction Robert and I rarely experience despite our successful careers. This moment of vulnerable reflection from a woman who had undoubtedly spent decades maintaining careful appearances touched me deeply. It takes remarkable courage to question the measures of success you've lived by, I acknowledged, especially when those measures have shaped your entire adult life. Robert is having a harder time with it, she admitted. His identity is so thoroughly wrapped up in status and influence. But seeing their presentation today, she paused, choosing her words carefully. It raises questions about what we might have accomplished with different priorities. We were interrupted by Catherine approaching with barely contained excitement. Mom, you're actually talking to Virginia. This is what I've been hoping for months. Elizabeth smiled with surprising warmth. We're discovering some common ground, though I doubt I'll ever be much of a gardener. You don't need to garden, Catherine assured her. Just be willing to see value in different approaches to life. That's all I've really wanted. As the afternoon progressed into early evening and guests gradually departed, Michael and Catherine began helping me clean up, refusing my suggestions that they should focus on their guests while I handled the kitchen. Before we head out, Catherine said as we finished the kitchen cleanup, there's something important we want to discuss with you, Virginia. She exchanged a meaningful glance with Michael before continuing. In our original wedding plans, we had minimized your involvement in ways that now make me deeply ashamed. This time, we'd like you to play a central role, not just as Michael's mother, but as someone whose wisdom and example have profoundly shaped our understanding of what matters in building a life together. We'd like you to perform a special reading during the ceremony, Michael explained, something you choose that reflects your perspective on authentic partnership and meaningful commitment. And we'd also like you to speak at the reception about the kind of marriage you and Dad created, the values and priorities that made it so solid despite never being flashy or socially impressive. This request moved me deeply, not just because it represented such a dramatic shift from their original approach, but because it revealed how thoroughly they had reconsidered what made a marriage meaningful. I would be honored, I told them. Sincerely. That's exactly why we want it, Catherine said with unexpected insight. The profound often disguises itself as simple. I've spent my entire life surrounded by impressive credentials and sophisticated opinions, yet found more wisdom in your straightforward approach to living than in all my parents' carefully curated expertise. 5 months later. September 15th dawned. Clear and perfect. The garden at its late summer glory with hydrangeas in full bloom and early autumn flowers adding rich color to the landscape. The space had been transformed with simple white chairs arranged in a semicircle around the old maple tree, its spreading branches creating a natural canopy for the ceremony to come. Catherine had asked to prepare for the wedding in my home rather than arriving ready, another significant departure from her original vision of professional styling teams and elaborate preparations at a luxury hotel. As I entered the guest bedroom, that had once been Michael's childhood room, I found her sitting at the small vanity, applying her own makeup with careful attention. "Need any help?" I offered, taking in the simple elegance of her dress. Not the designer gown with 20-foot train she had initially selected, but a beautifully crafted dress from a local seamstress, its clean lines and modest train perfectly suited for a garden celebration. "Actually, yes," she said, meeting my eyes in the mirror with a vulnerable smile. "My hands are shaking too much for this mascara. Wedding day nerves, I guess." As I helped with this small task, the intimacy of the moment struck me profoundly. This woman who had once viewed me as insufficiently sophisticated to be prominently included in her wedding was now choosing to prepare in my home, accepting my help with her appearance, incorporating elements of my garden and home into her special day. "Your parents arrived a few minutes ago," I mentioned carefully, knowing this remained a tender subject. "Your father actually complimented the garden layout." Catherine's expression reflected complicated emotions. "They're trying," she acknowledged. "It's not easy for them to accept something so different from what they imagined for their only daughter. But they're here, and that's what matters most today." As she finished her preparations, Catherine asked me to help with her grandmother's pearl necklace, a family heirloom she had chosen over the expensive diamond set her parents had purchased for her original wedding plans. "These feel right," she explained as I fastened the clasp. "They have history, meaning connection to something genuine rather than just monetary value." The ceremony itself was everything a wedding should be, focused entirely on the couple and their commitment, rather than on impressing guests or creating social media moments. Michael and Catherine exchanged vows they had written themselves, speaking with genuine emotion about their journey together, the challenges they had overcome, and the shared values that now formed the foundation of their relationship. "When we first got engaged," Catherine said during her vows, her voice clear and steady, "I thought I knew exactly what our life together would look like. A showcase of achievement and status, carefully curated to impress others. What I've discovered, instead, is something infinitely more valuable, a partnership based on purpose, on integrity, on genuine connection to what matters." When the time came for my reading, I shared a simple passage about marriage as a partnership of purpose rather than a social achievement. Words my late husband and I had discovered early in our own marriage and tried to live by throughout our years together. Not flowery rhetoric or sophisticated philosophy, but practical wisdom about prioritizing meaning over appearance, substance over impression. As the official pronounced them husband and wife, I glanced toward Catherine's parents, in the front row. Elizabeth was openly tearful, while Dr. Harrington maintained his composure, though with visible emotion. They had come, not entirely reconciled to this simplified version of their daughter's wedding, perhaps, but present and participating nonetheless. The reception that followed reflected the same authentic approach. Delicious food prepared by a local caterer rather than a celebrity chef, music from talented community musicians rather than an expensive orchestra, conversations that flowed naturally without the strategic networking that had characterized their original plans. As the evening progressed, I found myself standing somewhat apart, observing the celebration with quiet satisfaction. Dr. Harrington approached, holding 2 glasses of champagne and offering one to me, the first direct gesture of connection he had ever initiated. "Your garden is quite remarkable," he said after a moment of slightly awkward silence. "Catherine mentioned you do all the work yourself, without professional landscapers." "Yes," I confirmed. "It's been a labor of love for many years." "Much like raising children," he observed unexpectedly. "Though I'm beginning to think my approach to cultivation was perhaps too controlled, too focused on shaping rather than nurturing natural growth." The metaphor surprised me with its insight. "Different gardens require different approaches," I offered, "but all respond to genuine attention and respect for their nature." He nodded thoughtfully, watching Catherine laugh with genuine abandon as Michael twirled her on the small dance floor. "She's different," he said quietly. "Less perfect by certain standards, but more herself. I didn't even realize there was a difference until recently. It takes courage to choose authenticity over expectation, I acknowledged, for both parents and children. Indeed. He hesitated before continuing. Elizabeth mentioned that you've been something of a guide for Catherine this past year. I was skeptical, I admit. Your world seemed so removed from what we envisioned for her. Sometimes we need perspectives from outside our usual circles to see different possibilities, I suggested. He considered this, his expression softening slightly. Their practice is doing remarkably well, not by the metrics I would have applied initially, but by more meaningful measures: patient outcomes, staff retention, professional satisfaction. He shook his head slightly. Not the path I would have chosen for them, but I can't argue with the results. This modest acknowledgement represented significant movement from a man who had initially dismissed me as a small-town nurse playing at authority and had threatened to disinherit Catherine for changing course. Not a complete transformation, but an opening toward new understanding, much like the first crack in soil that allows a seedling to emerge. When it came time for my toast at the reception, I spoke simply about what I had learned through my own marriage, the quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful together, the strength that comes from shared values rather than shared status, the genuine happiness possible when authenticity takes priority over impression. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around us, Michael found a moment to join me at my favorite garden bench. I've been wanting to say something all day but haven't found the right moment, he began, his expression reflecting deep emotion. When I think about how close I came to losing this, to losing my connection to who I really am and what actually matters, it terrifies me. But you didn't lose it, I reminded him gently. You found your way back. Because you were courageous enough to maintain your integrity even when it would have been easier to compromise, he said. When I think about how I treated you during that period, minimizing your accomplishments, dismissing your concerns, excluding you from important decisions, I'm deeply ashamed. We all lose perspective sometimes, I said. What matters is the capacity to recognize it and find our way back to authentic values. As evening deepened around my garden and stars appeared above the celebration, Catherine approached to join me on the bench, carefully arranging her wedding dress beside me. May I join you for a moment of quiet? She asked. As wonderful as today has been, I find I need a brief pause to absorb it all. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the celebration continue across the garden. When Catherine finally spoke, her voice carried a depth of self-awareness that would have been unimaginable when we first met. I've been thinking about our first introduction, she said quietly. How dismissive I was of everything about you. Your home, your career, your perspective. I was so certain I knew what success looked like, what a life of significance required. I couldn't see the value in anything that didn't fit those narrow parameters. But my blindness was so complete, she continued, genuine regret in her voice. I saw your modest home and missed the warmth it contained. I heard about your nursing career and failed to recognize the impact you had on countless lives. I noticed your community involvement and dismissed it as small scale compared to my parents' prestigious board positions. She shook her head slightly. Most of all, I completely missed the quiet strength it takes to live authentically when everything around you measures value by entirely different standards. You see it now, I said simply. That's what matters. Because you showed me, she replied, meeting my eyes directly. Not by demanding recognition or insisting on your importance, but by simply being who you are with such unwavering clarity. The most powerful lesson wasn't in what you said, but in how you lived, without apology or compromise, even when it would have been easier to bend. As she rejoined the celebration, her words lingered in my mind. I hadn't set out to demonstrate how powerful I could be when Catherine dismissed me as a burden. I had simply continued living according to principles that had guided my entire life. integrity, compassion, and the quiet certainty that authentic purpose matters more than impressive appearances. After all the guests had departed and the newly married couple had left for a modest honeymoon at a lakeside cabin, I found a small envelope tucked beside my garden bench. Inside was a handwritten note in Catherine's elegant script. Virginia. As this day concludes, I wanted to leave you with one final thought. When I first entered your life, I saw you as a burden, someone to be managed and minimized because you didn't fit the narrative I was constructing. I couldn't have been more wrong. What I mistook for simplicity was actually clarity of purpose. What I dismissed as lack of sophistication was freedom from pretense. What I viewed as limited influence was actually quiet, profound impact that continues to ripple outward in ways I'm only beginning to understand. You showed me a kind of power I'd never recognized before. Not authority or control, but the quiet, strength that comes from living authentically according to genuine values. That lesson has changed everything for Michael and me, and will shape the life we build together going forward. With deepest gratitude and affection. Catherine. The note brought unexpected tears to my eyes, not because I needed this validation, but because it confirmed the genuine nature of the transformation I had witnessed. This wasn't strategic adjustment or calculated relationship management, but sincere recognition of a different way of measuring what matters in a life well lived. 2 weeks later, Michael and Catherine returned from their honeymoon. As we shared tea in the same kitchen where so many pivotal conversations had unfolded, they radiated a contentment that went beyond the normal post-wedding glow. "We have one more piece of news," Catherine said as they prepared to leave, exchanging a meaningful glance with Michael. "We've purchased a house, not the luxury condo we once planned, but a modest home with character and potential. It has a wonderful space for a garden." She smiled with genuine warmth. "We're hoping you might help us design it, teach us how, to create something that develops over time with patience and consistent care." This request, so symbolic of their transformed perspective, touched me deeply. "I'd be honored," I told them sincerely. "Though I should warn you that meaningful gardens, like meaningful lives, aren't created overnight. They require regular attention and a willingness to work with natural processes rather than forcing immediate results." "That's exactly what we're learning to appreciate," Michael replied. "The satisfaction of building something authentic rather than just impressive, whether it's a medical practice, a marriage, or a garden." As I watched them drive away, I reflected on the extraordinary journey we had shared. What had begun with painful exclusion, my son's fiancé viewing me as a burden to be minimized, had evolved into something none of us could have initially imagined. A catalyst for genuine reconsideration of values and priorities that had transformed their fundamental approach to life. I hadn't set out to show Catherine how powerful I could be. I had simply continued living according to the principles that had guided my entire life: integrity, compassion, and respect for human dignity. The true power wasn't in my position on the ethics board or in my capacity to challenge their practice plans. It lay in the consistent application of values that ultimately offered something Catherine had never experienced despite her privileged upbringing: authentic purpose beyond status or appearance. So if you're watching this and feeling dismissed or underestimated by those who should value you most, remember, true power rarely announces itself with demands for recognition. It lives quietly in consistent choices, in unwavering values, in the courage to stand firmly in your truth, even when others fail to see its worth. Sometimes, the most profound influence we ever have isn't through what we say or demand, but through who we are and how we live. A truth I discovered when my son's wife thought I was a burden, and then discovered exactly how powerful I could be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.